you've been painting Warhammer for a while now, then the Citadel Painting System was probably how you learned to paint. Whether you bought the books, or your friends or the people down at the local games workshop taught you how to paint, or your first introduction to painting was Duncan's painting tutorials on Warhammer TV, you probably learned that you pick up your easily labelled Citadel paints and you apply your base coat, give your mini a wash, highlight the details, and then add some sand and tufts and boom, you're on your way to being a world-famous heavy metal painter. This system is known as the Citadel Painting System, and like the name hints, it's kind of the official way that Games Workshop teaches you how you should paint your miniatures. And this is also how I was taught how to paint my miniatures, and for a really long time this method has done me super well, and I have created some really great miniatures using this base coat wash layer system. But after some time, I think I've come to the conclusion that painters who paint things like this, and who win things like this, probably aren't using the Citadel Painting System, or any of the methods that we've been taught by Games Workshop and have even perfected for years and years. So if, like me, you're feeling a little bit trapped in your old habits and painting style, and you want to push yourself to try something new, then this video is going to be for you, because me and you are going to unlearn the Citadel Painting System and try some new and super easy ways that we can push our painting and our painting style to the next level. Whoosh. That way. So to start with, what exactly is the Citadel Painting System and where did it come from? The system is how Games Workshop has historically taught people how to paint their Warhammer miniatures, both in publications like White Dwarf, codexes, and even dedicated painting books for around the last 30 years. And it follows the basic system of base coating your miniature, usually with some darker colours, giving it a wash, which is essentially covering your mini with an ink or more recently a Citadel shade, and then building your colours up in a series of lighter layers of paint in the highlight stage. Base, wash, highlight. That's basically the system. And you may be wondering, what's wrong with this way of painting? And why am I ragging on it so much? What's my problem? Why am I like this? Well, I want to make it really clear right now that I really like the Citadel Painting System. I think it serves a great purpose, and like I said, it's how I painted for years and years. It's a great starting point for learning how to do basic painting skills, it's easy to learn, teach and replicate, and at its core, it really works. But sometimes when you're looking at Golden Demon winning miniatures and then you compare them to your own miniatures, which maybe you've spent hours on, something just feels different. Something's not quite adding up. Like, they're clearly doing something you're not, even though you feel like you are a very well practiced and pretty good painter. And that's probably because a lot of the time these people are fundamentally painting using completely different methods. So in this video, what I really want to do is help you break some of those very small but heavily taught and very common painting methods to maybe take you one step closer to upping your painting game, whether it's for speed or showmanship. And speaking of which, if you're into tips and tricks to help you with your painting, then please take a second to consider joining my Patreon. You'll get access to a bunch of painting tutorials made by me, as well as other videos and bloopers and stuff like that, and you'll also get to hop into the Rogue Hobbies Discord server, which is, in my opinion, one of the best and busiest hobby spaces on the internet. Also, by signing up to any tier, you'll just be helping me by supporting my channel, which means I get to come here and make more videos for free, which is awesome and I love it, so thank you very much for all your support, and let's get back to the video. So before we get into some things that you can be doing better, let's first talk about some things which may be hindering your path to painting enlightenment right now, starting with the Citadel Painting System, because despite its ease of access and usually reliable results, I do think it has some pretty big flaws and limitations. Firstly, I find the whole thing a bit inefficient and very time consuming, especially the first two steps. Base coating always takes forever, and that's kind of unavoidable, and now that miniatures are getting more and more insanely detailed, it does mean that this step feels like it takes more and more time to do every single year, even when painting the most basic infantry miniature, like this one here. Then, when you're all done base coating, you have to move on to the next step, and that is the real time killer. An all-over wash will often do its job and darken the recesses of your miniature, which is great, but then you often have to spend just as long as you did base coating, waiting for your miniature to fully dry all over, and then after that, you have to start re-highlighting your miniatures with colours similar to your base coat, just to bring it back up to your desired lighter tones again, and all of this takes forever. Another issue I often find is that Citadel washes dry a little bit streaky, shiny, or even sometimes with a weird white haze over them, and once I've applied a more matte or satin layer on top of the washed areas, the overall finish of the miniature when I'm done will be a bit inconsistent, and that's always a bummer. On top of this, the style and the quality of the end result kind of relies on you painting everything to the same level of detail. Games Workshop kind of teaches us to use this method on every single part of our miniatures, so we usually use this system to work around every detail on our minis. Base coating, washing and highlighting everything from the face to the smallest of accessories, and that can also be a real time killer. Usually a miniature has just a few focal points, like the face or other elements at the front of the miniature, but do we need to be base coating, washing and highlighting a bag and a shadowy armpit to the same standard as our orc's face? Well, maybe not, and maybe it would look cooler, more realistic and save us time if that particular detail was a bit more shadowy. And as a wise painter once told me, if you can't see it when the miniature is assembled, then you probably don't need to paint it. And finally, for me personally, when I was learning how to paint using the Games Workshop approved painting style on Games Workshop miniatures, I kind of felt more inclined to use the Games Workshop paint range to go alongside it. The Citadel paints are all designed with the Citadel Painting System in mind and are labelled as such with base, shade and layer to help people understand how to paint using that system, and that is fine and good, and like I said, I really like the Citadel paint range, but it still feels a little bit limiting, especially if you're painting exactly to the rules of the system like I am here with this orc. But somehow also at the same time it feels really overwhelming too. Like, there are a lot of paints in the range. There's so many paints, but a lot of them are also really similar in tone, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a bunch of them. You could probably cut a bunch of colours and paints from this range, and I honestly don't think I'd care or even notice. For the sake of this video, I also didn't do any paint mixing on my Citadel painting style orc, and in fact I tried to use paint names which kind of matched what I was painting like I would back in the day. I used Wa flesh for the skin and various leather and hide labelled browns for the details, which, whilst working, did leave this orc looking a little bit samey in the detail department and a tad desaturated too. And here is my orc done to the best of my ability using the Citadel painting style, and like I said before, the system works and he definitely looks like a good, well-painted miniature. But either way, he still took me a really long time to paint, I think. For one miniature, he took me like 4 hours, and I think that's because I had to let the wash dry and then re-highlight him, and it just took a really long time. And also, I'm not 100% happy with the end results, so let's see how I would go around breaking some of the rules of the Citadel painting system that we just saw to maybe give me a boost in the right direction. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the thing we all do before painting our miniature, and that is priming. And if I'm being honest, I don't really have a strong opinion about which primer is best as far as quality a paint job goes, but certainly if you're looking to speed up your paint jobs, then there are some smart decisions that you can make during this step. Truthfully, I quite like using black primer on most of my projects because it hides a lot of mistakes, especially if you're layering up dark colours on top of your base coat, which is probably what what you're going to be doing anyways if you were using the Citadel Painting System. But I know that this new orc I'm painting now is going to have a lot of light yellowy greens and lighter tan leathery colours when he's finished, and so using this lighter sandy coloured primer will help me get those colours built up whilst base coating much quicker and using a lot less layers, which also means less texture and a smoother end result. Speaking of which, let's now move on to the base coating stage using some of my new and improved methods. Like I said, a lot of Games Workshop's base colours are very dark. Waflesh, Corn Red and even XV88 used to be some of my favourites for painting orcs, but if you want your orcs to end up being lighter, then you're gonna have to work all the way up from your base coat and your darker wash to the lighter tones, which is a lot of stages and building up of layers in between. Something which I've seen the heavy metal folks doing much more commonly now is starting with lighter colours, and I've been absolutely loving doing this too in my own painting. Recently, I've been kind of using my base coats as a starting point for my layering stage, and I'll use lighter colours and even do some simple wet blending to bring out the highlights in larger areas like on the skin and the clothes and the leather details here. And this, in conjunction with the next step, is what I feel is really going to save you time painting your miniatures and maybe even make them look cooler too. This next tip is a massive one which I had to unlearn in order to improve my own painting at home, and that is to stop overusing Citadel washes and shades. This is something I unlearned a few years ago, and I promised it changed the way I painted forever, because it turns out not everything needs to be washed with a shade. Or shaded with a wash, you know what I mean. When I was painting the skin on this orc, I spent a bunch of time base coating it with some nice lighter tones and doing some of that lovely wet blending to get it looking as smooth as I possibly could. Now, imagine if after all of that, I decided to just slap a bunch of Bealtan green or something all over it. Sure, it would go into all of the recesses and the creases and all of that good stuff, but I think mostly it would just be a massive mess, and it would really just muddy up all of that lovely smooth blending I did in the previous step, and unfortunately I would have to end up just re-highlighting it all in the hopes that it would end up looking as good as it did before I washed it. So instead of washing the whole miniature, in order to give it contrast in the recesses and shadowy areas, I did something else instead, and I recess shaded the miniature, which means that instead of applying an all-over wash, I used thin layers of another paint to darken the recesses and add contrast to the miniature. And you can do this method with any paint in your collection. All you have to do is thin it down into a wash consistency, either with some paint medium or a little bit of water. And you may not believe me here, but taking the time to recess shade your mini will actually save you time as well. And depending on how clean you want your mini to be in the end, it can definitely also result in a much neater paint job with a more controllable and consistent finish at the end. This orc probably isn't the best example of a clean paint job using this method. I was a bit messy with it as I wanted him to look quite organic, but let's take a look at this Space Marine shoulder pad as a better example. The one I painted using the Citadel painting method doesn't really give the smooth, clean result that you usually want for something like an ultramarine, as the wash makes it look messy and so do the layers. But by simply using a lighter base coat with a very simple blend, a recess shade and a single highlight, it's not only quicker, but looks much cleaner. But whilst it looks better, it's still a little bit boring. Like, what if you want to break out the Citadel painting system because everything you're painting is starting to look a little bit samey? Well, the way to do that is just to be more experimental with your colours. So you've probably noticed that one of the big differences between this orc and my other one is that this one is pretty saturated. And I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but what should be your cup of tea is trying to incorporate more colour into your paint jobs, even if those colours aren't as saturated as mine. One of my favourite things in miniature painting, and something I'm actively trying to learn how to do myself, is using more colourful shadows. And here's some examples of what I mean by that. I just think that having coloured undertones on a mini just adds so much interest to it and makes it far less boring. The Citadel Painting System would teach us that in order to paint these tanned leather trousers, we should start with dark tanned leather colour, shade with a dark tanned leather shade, and then build up to more tanned leather colours. But why not have just a little bit more fun with it? For the trousers on this new orc, I used some pinky purple shadows and then mixed in some purple and lighter browns for the midtones, and then I mixed in some bright saturated yellows for the highlights. And for painting the orc skin, something I absolutely love doing is adding in a bunch of pink and red tones to make him look way more realistic and fleshy and organic, and in my opinion, this way of doing orc skin is just so much better. Even with the metallics, I mixed in a bunch of turquoisey blue to make them look a bit more bright and interesting, and less dull and grey like usual metallics tend to be. And I think that having a little bit of fun with your paints and your colour choices makes a massive difference towards making your miniature look better painted and less boring, with what is really minimal effort. Now it's time to talk about the next most important part of painting your miniature, which is the highlighting stage. And I think it's true of any method of painting, but the quality of your paint job is kind of going to depend on how long you want to spend painting it. I usually like to spend most of my time doing this step, but I am a chronic over highlighter, and there's a strong possibility that I learned that bad habit from my years of following the Citadel Painting System, where I would spend ages doing around 4 to 5 different highlight colors, followed by 2 to 3 edge highlights on just my orc skin alone. But here's another tip that the first time I was told it by another great painter, it absolutely blew my mind, and that is that flat can actually be good. What I mean by that is simply that you don't have to overcomplicate everything in order for it to look good on a miniature. And in fact, often something as simple as a base coat and a small edge highlight looks much better than a base coat, a wash, 4 layers, and 3 edge highlights. And again, I find that Space Marines are a great example of this, and are often much more suited to a nice smooth base coat, careful pin shading, and simple highlighting, which, if done neatly, will result in an altogether cleaner and smoother looking miniature with like 6 less steps in it as well, so you're also saving a ton of time. But even on things like the orc's gun here, I think it looks much brighter and more eye-catching with a simple blend, a recess wash, and a single yellowish highlight. It's easy and it's effective. So at this point the miniature is looking pretty much done, but I've actually managed to save a bunch of time painting him up to this step, so I'm going to do a few more super simple things to really push this miniature to the next level. Things like weathering, chipping, and freehanding are becoming more commonplace techniques, with tutorials on the subject coming out more and more often on Warhammer TV, even at the more beginner levels, and that is great to see. But for a long time these were considered to be like extra or more advanced techniques, and they're really not. They're so easy, let me show you. Weathering and chipping is such an easy way to really make your miniatures look so much cooler, and it's so quick to do as well. I ended up thinning down some orange paint until it was pretty watery, and I added it to some of the recesses of the metal details for a super quick and easy rust effect. Then I decided I would do a bit of freehanding, so with some light ivory paint I added some orky jags to the gun casing and some cool war paint to the orc's face, and I think the end effect looks amazing and makes it look like maybe I spent way longer painting this guy than I actually did. Then I picked out a few areas like the red gun casing and the red belt buckle, and I used some darker browns and a tiny brush tip to make some little chips and scratches around the outside of the metal where it would naturally chip the most. Then I used a lighter colour to highlight the chips and scratches underneath them to make the effect look super 3D and effective, and this literally took me about a minute to do. So now that I have 2 fully painted orc miniatures, let's compare them to each other and see how they rank up. Firstly, the Citadel Painting System orc. This guy really took me back, as I painted him exactly how I used to paint my old orcs back in the day. And I honestly still really like him, and I think he looks awesome, and I still think it's not entirely clear which one is the better painted of the 2. He's well defined, and the contrast on him is really good, and I'm sure that loads of people will be of the opinion opinion that he is the better of the two, because he's a bit more grimdark, and I think a lot of people just love that style. So let me know in the comments section which one is your favourite, and if it's this guy. But in my opinion, I just think he's a bit dull. I think highlighting browns with desaturated browns and greens with desaturated greens, whilst easy, doesn't make the miniature look very dynamic in the end. Now let's compare him to the other orc, which I do think I like much more. It's been ages since I've kind of quickly painted a bog standard infantry orc like this, and I think I've become a much more developed painter since the last time I did it, and honestly it shows in my painting, and that makes me really happy. I love the colours and the saturation, and especially the skin tones. I think they look awesome, and I'm glad that I spent more time on areas like the face and the last minute weathering and chipping and freehanding details, because I think they make all the difference whilst not actually taking me that much time. In the end, this newer orc did take me around the same amount of time, if not a fraction less than the other orc, just because I wasn't waiting for 100 washes to dry. But importantly, I think doing the miniature like this pushed me out of my comfort zone, taught me much more new things about painting miniatures, and maybe helped me advance my painting skills much more as well. But I think the main thing that is going to make you a better painter, and maybe the biggest tip for this whole video, is just time and patience, and as always, loads and loads of practice. And I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching this video, I really hope you enjoyed it, and as usual, thank you for being rogues. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!